Okay, this is an audio review for The Color of Justice by Michelle Alexander. So this is basically a segment of a chapter that's a chapter in her book, The New Jim Crow, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it. And probably by the end of this lecture, if you're interested, I would again suggest read it. It's great. Anyway, so she's talking about issues of, social inequalities in the legal system, right? Specifically in the criminal justice system. So she talks about race and the law, right? So she gives people as examples to illustrate some of the points she's talking about in the overall book. So MFA Stewart is a 30-year-old single African-American mother of two who was arrested in a drug sweep of her apartment complex. So she is innocent. And after a week in jail, she wants to get home to take care of her kids, right? She's left them in this situation because of the drug sweep. So she has a court-appointed lawyer or attorney who suggests that she pleads guilty to a distribution charge, take a plea deal, right? But she says no, she's not going to take a plea deal because she's innocent. She didn't do anything wrong, right? So she refuses to take the plea deal and she just stays in jail. So now it's been nearly a month. She's been in jail. She decides, you know what? It's time. She's going to take the plea deal because she needs to get back home to her family, right? So she receives 10 years probation and has to pay $1,000 in fines plus court and probation costs. And she's now branded a drug felon. And so as a result of this, there's all these consequences that come with being branded a drug felon. So this is what Michelle Alexander calls the cruel hand, which we'll talk about in a minute. So basically, as a drug felon, she's no longer eligible for food stamps. She can't vote for at least 12 years, as is the case in most states. It's about 7 to 11 years. In some states, it's forever. You can never vote again. While in only 2 states, you can vote once you are done with all of your stuff. And so, basically after about she just leaves jail because she's been there for a month. She decides she needs to take care of her kids, but she doesn't understand the consequences that come with that drug felony of that plea bargain, right? So as a result, not only can she not vote, she's discriminated away from jobs because she has to mark that box on the job application that says, were you convicted of a felony or a drug felony? She lived in public housing when the whole drug sweep happened. So she gets kicked out. She gets evicted from her public housing because if you have a drug felony, you can't live in public housing. So this causes Emma to become homeless, which results in her losing custody of her 2 kids, which was the whole reason she took the plea deal in the first place, was to get out so she could take care of her kids. But now because of this felony that she agreed to, because of the system itself kind of gave her very little options, now she has the consequence of that, right? So, the judge eventually dismissed the charges for everyone else who remained in jail. So, because the sweep itself was based on faulty testimony from one informant. So she's now vindicated in her innocence, but she's still considered a drug felon by the law. So she's now homeless and she can't get her kids back. And so this is just, one example of the kind of flawed nature of the system, how it targets people that have the least amount of power. And because you have very little power, you have no way to navigate or circumvent the system. That the system has a lot to do with those hegemonies, those power systems of, race, class, gender, sexuality, all that kind of fun stuff. Another example is Clifford, who returns to his home in Bryant, Texas, to attend the funeral of his 18-month-old daughter. And before he can go to the funeral, he's detained by police. And so they basically take him into custody and they refuse to let him go to his daughter's funeral. So he doesn't get to say goodbye to her, his baby girl. So he's told by prosecutors that he has to testify against a defendant that was caught in a recent drug bust. But he says, I wasn't here. I didn't actually see that incident. I can't speak as a witness to it. They said that they would charge him with refusing to cooperate. And they said they would indict him on felony charges as a result of that, right? So he was like, screw that. He stays in jail. He was in jail for over a month, right? All the charges were eventually dropped. But his life was negatively impacted forever. I mean, not being able to say goodbye to his baby girl, but also, in a more practical sense, he lost his job because not most jobs aren't going to let you like not show up for a month. He lost his apartment, same deal. They expect you to keep paying that rent and being present for that. And, all his furniture was repossessed, all of that kind of stuff. So it leaves him in a very unstable position because you're leaving jail and now you have no job, nowhere to stay, right? It just makes everything much harder in that situation. All prefaced on him doing nothing, right? Him refusing to cooperate supposedly in a situation where he wasn't actually a witness, so he couldn't give testimony of being a witness when he wasn't a witness. So, she talks about these two examples as a way to kind of illustrate some of the specific conditions that people face and how overwhelming the system is, how powerful the system is, and how people are not able to kind of circumvent that system without having power themselves, right? So she uses this quote in the chapter that I took, for this, that says, in every state across our nation, African Americans, particularly in the poorest neighborhoods, are subjected to tactics and practices that would result in public outrage and scandal if committed in middle-class white neighborhoods. So this is part of that kind of understanding of why is it that, middle-class white communities or richer communities see police as protectors, as saviors, as someone to call when you have a problem. But if you live in a community that doesn't have that same power status, that same protection, that same ability to call the police and they show up and help you instead of, stop and detain you and harass you, then you're just not going to have that same kind of situation. So she says this to point out that if people that had power in our culture were being treated so inhumanely, we would be outraged. But because it's the most marginal that are being targeted through these systems, we don't care. Or we have all of these ideologies in society that have bias and discrimination to justify treating people unequally. Okay, so law enforcement, the way that laws have been enforced and the way that, communities have been kind of policed has really changed due to the war on drugs. So she uses information from Human Rights Watch as a way to kind of explain how these disparities have, kind of developed. So she looks at racial disparities in sentencing. So the system itself is supposed to be race neutral, right? We're told the war on drugs is a war on a thing, like drugs. But in this chapter, Alexander's arguing that the war is really against a group of people, right? So according to Human Rights Watch, in the year 2000, in 7 states, African Americans made up 80 to 90% of all drug offenders that were sent to prison that year. And in 15 states, Black people are imprisoned on drug charges 25 to 57 times more than white drug users. So again, enter into this understanding the war on drugs, that within 3 years of the advent of the war on drugs, the prison admissions of African Americans skyrocketed, quadrupling in number. By 2000, the number of people incarcerated was more than 26 times the rate it was in 1983, 22 times higher for Latinos, and 8 times higher for whites. So we can see that there's a racial disparity going on there. 3/4 of the imprisoned have been Blacks and Latinos, while the majority of illegal drug users and dealers are white. So why is it that they're not being represented? If it's just a matter of a colorblind system that are just putting people in prison based on their usage of drugs, why is it that only it's people of color being roped into the system? So much more, so much disproportionately, right? And so surveys have been conducted to show that people of all races use illegal drugs at remarkably similar rates. And the drug markets reflect racial and socioeconomic boundaries, meaning most users are going to buy drugs locally. So that means you're often going to end up with someone with the same social class, the same race that's selling you drugs, right? So that's kind of how these networks get swept up. Yet in 2006, for example, 1 out of every 14 Black men was incarcerated compared to 1 in 106 ratio for white men. So this is due largely to the racial bias of the drug war practices themselves that assume that drugs are being used in higher quantities in more ways in poor communities of color, which again, just from a logic perspective, makes absolutely no damn sense. If you don't have money, how do you have more drugs, right? If anything, I mean, we should be looking at richer communities that have the financial, wherewithal or opportunity for these things. And again, if we look at actual criminological research that examines usage patterns, we find that that's remarkably similar. So why are we seeing such different rates in who's in prison? It's policing. It's where policing is done, right? That policing is done in a very geographic way, right? So it's something that she talks about a lot more in the full book, right? About hotspot policing, or this idea of looking at crime as a geographic factor, that it's certain neighborhoods that are bad neighborhoods, and if you just hyper police those neighborhoods, you'll stop crime. So why is it then in over 40 years of the drug war that we haven't actually stopped drug usage? Drug usage has not dropped, right? Amount of people in prison has skyrocketed and ballooned, yet that hasn't really affected the actual streets when it comes to the drug proliferation. And this makes complete sense if you think about it. Because if you're supposed to target kingpins, which is what the policy was meant to do, right? The war on drugs was supposed to stop the big players at the top, right? But what it really did was focus on the low-level people at the bottom. And largely, this is a matter of convenience. So think of it this way. Let me back up a minute, too. Another factor that she talks about in the overall book is the issue of globalization, meaning that in a lot of these poor neighborhoods where people were redlined and trapped in these neighborhoods because of inequality in the past, those industries that used to provide a middle-class standard of living, or at least some comfort of a standard of living, disappeared in the 50s, 60s, and 70s as they were offshored or outsourced to other places so that the people that own those industries can make more money by paying people less to do them, right? So the car industry, things like that is an example. So if you were working at a car factory making what would be today's equivalent 60 grand a year, and all of a sudden your only options are minimum wage employment, right, then obviously you can support your family with that. And the jobs themselves withered up, like the opportunities themselves withered up quite a bit, and a lot more opportunities popped up in areas where you would need transportation to them, in areas that don't have large transportation structures, suburban areas, things like that. So those jobs went to people that have more financial access and privilege and cars, right? So anyway, what's interesting is when all the jobs disappear and there's scarce jobs and there's a lot of competition for those scarce jobs, then what happens, right? Well, an underground economy pops up to, fill in the gap. A place that doesn't matter what your GPA was, or you don't need 3 letters of reference or things like that to sell drugs. So the drug market became very visible in a lot of these communities, especially by the 1980s and early 90s, because there was such economic decay that was happening as a result of globalization, right? And other social inequalities. So what's interesting, though, is that then the crime rates serve as their own explanation, right? Meaning if you send out cops, they arrest 100 people a night in this neighborhood, then there's so many stats coming out of that neighborhood versus like Brentwood or, the Hollywood Hills or something like that. So it kind of becomes an explanation or a justification for the unequal treatment, meaning look at all the people arrested over here. We have to put more cops here because that's where all the arrests are, instead of seeing that it's kind of a reflection of policing more than a reflection of deviance, right? So it's interesting. Who do we consider the most deviant society socially? Well, that's who we consider the most criminal, right? Why is it, and this is something I think it's fascinating, but she doesn't really talk about it in the chapter, but I'm just throwing it in there, is why is it we don't care about white-collar crime? Why is it that a handful of people can destroy the entire world's economy and none of them go to jail? But a guy selling $5 worth of drugs in his pocket, in some situations, depending on the drug, can get a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years. Why is that? Right? Well, it's because, as conflict theorists would argue, the structure of law reflects the structure of power, right? So we see people as more deviant depending on how much marginality they have. So we see street crime as the most threatening thing, even though, obviously destroying the world's global economy, not great, right? And cause all sorts of horrible, catastrophic consequences for many people. Many people lost their jobs, their homes, all these things. But we focus really on a guy robbing someone for $20 or something like that being the most egregious crime in our culture. So it's interesting that, again, the crime rates are geographic, meaning in these poor neighborhoods where open-air drug markets form, it means that you can drive by and see a drug deal in progress, which you can't necessarily see in a middle-class neighborhood. You'd have to do more detective work, right, to figure out, to kind of like track those things down. So it's easier geographically as like a fish in a barrel method if police just drive through poor neighborhoods, find those open-air drug markets, point at people and go, hey, you, and arrest them, versus, in middle class neighborhoods, people can meet in their homes, or they can have kind of more clandestine ways to do that aren't just open air drug markets. So it's a lot harder to actually like find the drug users without, just kind of stumbling upon them by driving by. So it's like a fish in a barrel, policy that, and again, she gets into this in the entire book, but there's a financial motivation for this kind of policing, meaning that when the war on drugs first started, police didn't want anything to do with it, largely because they didn't see drugs as the number one issue. They were worried about violent crimes. And we have actually seen the relationship as the war on drugs has taken over, the amount of violent crimes that are solved has dropped pretty much across the board, right? So that's obviously problematic because violent crimes we should care about. So, what's interesting though too is that how did they co-opt the police into agreeing to these policies was to give them funding, to give them money. So for example, if you get stopped and a police officer goes through your pockets and they suspect you of a drug crime, you're not charged, you're not convicted, you are suspected, right? Then they can take the money in your pocket and the car you're driving without any sort of charge against you. And that's, what we call civil assets forfeiture under the war on drugs. And so the logic of that was to go after kingpins. Like you go after like a Pablo Escobar, for example. Someone like that is only able to operate because they pay off the police, they pay off the judges, they pay off everybody. And really, the drug cartels are a great example of this. For example, a lot of people argue for decriminalization or legalization because that would affect their financial ability. So for example, California legalized marijuana, right? Let's say it was done nationally, right? In some magical world that was done. Then that's about 60%, or at least, obviously it's not as if the drug cartels release their financial records every year, but it's estimated to be about 60% of their income is marijuana sales. So if that became, decriminalized or legalized across the United States, then guess what? There goes 60% of the money going to drug cartels, right? Which means then they can't use that money to buy cops, to buy judges, to buy whatever. So the idea of the civil assets forfeiture is to go after kingpins, right? You suspect them, but you haven't charged them of a crime. You can take away their property, shut down their bank accounts, things like that. Because fun fact, drug kingpins, they don't just do it for the power and the weird outfits. They do it, or the living in tunnels, right? So in the El Chapo cases, they do it for the money. So the idea is you go after the money. But the civil assets forfeiture is really being used to take $20 out of people's pockets that barely have $20 all over this country every day, or take the cars out of their possession. And it's really not being focused in the way it's supposed to. So it's interesting how power dynamics really play into this, meaning the crime rates just serve as a justification. So you have, a situation where more people of color in prison, well, then they must be more criminal, right? Or more people in this particular community go to jail, then it must be a bad community, instead of, really looking at how the policing itself is serving that inequality. Obviously, the media has a lot to do with the racialized perceptions that we have of drug criminals. And so this was largely a big influence, especially during the Reagan era of the war on drugs, right? When it really got ramped up. And really, media's message was that drugs, especially crack cocaine, were dangerous and could kill you. And they argued for the legitimacy of the war on drugs on very moralistic terms, right? Such as protecting children, which led to a public conception of drug users as threatening, as trying to kill your kids, as trying to, steal your kids and hook them on drugs for some reason or whatever it might be, right? And so news reports specifically focused on urban offenders in inner city areas, when we know statistically drug use is about the same across racial lines, across social class lines. Yet the majority of people featured on the news being addicts that were arrested, especially, when they do these high profile, storming into crack houses, things like that. It'd be white police officers and people of color. Something interesting in my crim class, I actually have a video. It's like a 7-hour videos of news coverage from that time. I use this as an additional resource for that class, that if they really want to sit through it, they can watch the horrible crime coverage of that time period and really just see how night after night, day after day, seeing these images over and over create a certain racialized understanding of drug use, right? And really a racialized understanding of police, as if people of color aren't police officers, or as if white people aren't drug users, right? It's actually interesting, in the first couple of years of drug enforcement against crack cocaine in Los Angeles County, 0 white people were arrested for crack cocaine usage, even though, again, crack cocaine was never only a drug for people of color. It's always been something that was used by, different segments of the population. But it was this media onslaught of, constant coverage, constant all the time, that really associated the drug with low-income people of color. So the subtle argument that a group of people are experiencing a sort of social decay due to the introduction of crack cocaine, it becomes a justification to hyperpolice these areas. And it affects the way that we then see them as, competent of mind, that we see it as like necessary to help these communities. It's a really good way to target a community and point at them and say, they're bad. Look at what they're doing. It's bad. Instead of saying, where are the jobs? Where's the decent education? Where are the opportunities for any escape from this horrible reality? Otherwise, of course, people are going to end up self-medicating and doing drugs, because if there's no way out, then what the hell is the point, right? So these messages, this media onslaught doesn't just it's not just some, oh, well, it causes bias, it affects people, but it really affects juries, judges, police, politicians, prosecutors, right? The person that she says has the most power within this system are prosecutors. All of these people who inhabit those jobs or roles are also people themselves outside of those roles. So the racialized ideology of the time permeates the social understandings. And so these stereotypes really affect people's perceptions of who's worthy, who is redeemable, and just the likelihood of criminality. So there's almost an assumption you're a poor person of color, you live in this neighborhood, you must be a drug user, even though overwhelmingly that's not a reflection of the actual community. So another quote from the book, the notion that most illegal drug use and sales are happening in the ghetto is pure fiction, right? There's no data to actually support that. It's more a reflection of the policing. Okay, so what accounts for the racial disparities in the criminal justice system? Well, that's most of her book. So I'll get into a little bit of it here, but otherwise I'll just tell you the whole damn thing, but it's fine. It's a great book. I really recommend it. So the first stage that she calls is discretion, meaning the system operates in a couple different stages, but the first is to grant law enforcement personnel extraordinary discretion as to whom they stop, who they investigate further, who they arrest, and who they charge. So this allows beliefs, stereotypes, policies, and assumptions to unduly influence the decision of officials. So this is what we talk about, like racial profiling or things of that nature. Who you get to stop and search, who, or even for prosecutors, again, the most powerful person in the system, they get to decide who gets charged and who gets a slap on the wrist, right? So the influence of stereotypes on policy can't be overstated. That the racialized nature of the war on drugs, especially the crack epidemic, led to this unspoken racial bias that then morphed itself into policies. So why else would there be such discrepancies in sentences between crack cocaine and regular cocaine? Something we didn't get into in class, but there's something they call from that era that she's speaking of, the late 80s, early 90s, what we call the 100-to-1 rule, meaning they basically said that the sentencing criteria for crack cocaine possession or usage was 100-to-1 ratio for crack cocaine to powder cocaine. So meaning if you had 5 grams of crack cocaine, you could meet the federal standard for the mandatory minimum of up to 15 years, right? If you had 500 grams of powder cocaine, you could meet the same standard. So think about that. Who's associated with using powder cocaine? Who's associated with using crack cocaine, right? When we know that, again, crack cocaine was used across socioeconomic and racial lines, but who was the media saying only use crack cocaine? Now, who do we think of using powder cocaine? These are almost like the most powerful people, right? The stockbrokers and, all the Wall Street folks. So the wealthiest, the whitest, right? So why then will we create a law that says that one form of cocaine is much more dangerous than the other? Well, it has everything to do with who we associate it with, right? If we associate it with a more deviant marginality, a poor person of color, then that's a more threatening crime that we need to lock up. But if it's associated with some guy, doing coke in between his, time on the trading floor, the stock exchange, somehow that's not threatening. Why? Because the person itself is not deviant. They're rich, they're white, they have all the hegemony. So it's interesting how the person itself affects the way that we then determine, what kind of justice, quote unquote, happens, right? And so the 100-to-1 rule is just such an egregious, perfect example of inequality in how it manifests in the law, or at least as conflict theorists would say, how the law is structured to be in the interest of the powerful, right? So it's interesting that, 5 grams is like less than like half of an envelope, right? Versus 500 grams of powder cocaine is like more than a suitcase. Like that's a lot of cocaine to be like carrying around, right? So the kind of same criteria for mandatory minimum sentences is ridiculous at the 100-to-1 rule. So eventually people realized, hey, that's probably not fair. During the Obama administration, they wanted to address this 100-to-1 rule, so they revised it to be 18-to-1. Now you just get 18 times a higher penalty for crack cocaine than you do for powder cocaine. So for me, I don't think 18 equals 1, so I don't think it's fair. While 18 is a much smaller number than 100, it's still BS and it's still unfair, right? So it's interesting how the laws themselves reflect these power dynamics, right? So that's just part of this, how the discrepancies in sentencing work. But also, the second stage that she says, it's not just about giving people discretion as to who's threatening and who's not. The second stage is to disable the ability of the court system to consider claims of racial discrimination. Meaning, in the system itself, to prove that there's been racial discrimination against you, it is incredibly high standard proof you have to have in order to prove racial discrimination. Meaning in the past, you could just say, okay, there's a statistical inequality in the system. Like you can show that there's a racial disparity in the system, whether it's the length of sentences, how many people get charged, how many people get convicted, all of it, right? There's discrepancies at every level of this, right? So what the system itself did was set a precedent in a legal court filing where they basically said that you cannot, as a person individually, use statistics to prove that you've been discriminated against in the system. I mean, what? So the only way that you can prove discrimination cases, which is pretty impossible and unobtainable in pretty much all cases, is to prove that some official intentionally had racist discrimination or bigotry towards you. So you can't demonstrate that there's clearly a discriminatory outcome of the legal process. You have to somehow find a person who has like said a bunch of racial epithets to your face or said, because you are blank, I'm putting you in prison, which doesn't happen. It puts such a huge burden on someone to prove unless you're O.J. Simpson, then you have Mark Furman throwing the N-word around the whole damn time, then it's pretty easy to show that that was discrimination. But for most of us, that's just not the case. And so trying to prove that you're being, unfairly treated is so hard, right, in this system. So it makes it extraordinarily effective for promoters of the system of racial control because they can basically just blind the population to it and say, no, it's just colorblind. It's just you did a crime, you do the time. That's all it is. And that it isn't a reflection of unequal policing. It isn't a reflection of unequal structures in the community, of financial inequalities and who has a lawyer and who doesn't, right? So, and it again has this horrible perception that comes with the colorblind rhetoric that says that there must just be more criminality, right? And so it's taken out of the context of racial segregation or policing. It becomes a circular logic that if more African Americans are incarcerated, then it must be the result of more criminality as a group, which is obviously not the reality there. So how does this then formally colorblind criminal justice system achieve such racially discriminatory results? Well, really, she, in a few steps, connects it to a racialized caste system. So again, I know I'm giving you like the whole damn summary for the whole damn book, but really, in the book, she talks about how over time, she argues in American society, we've had racial caste systems in order to control Black bodies. So the first and most obvious being slavery, right? And she argues that in each racial caste system, whether it was slavery, whether it was Jim Crow segregation, or in the modern era mass incarceration, she argues that during those time periods, what it meant to be Black was associated with the racial caste system, right? So during slavery, what it meant to be Black was to be a possession, to be a thing, to be 3/5 of a person for legal standards, all those kind of things, right? In Jim Crow segregation times, to be Black meant to be a second-class citizen legally, to be legally excluded from things. And then, of course, in the modern era, under mass incarceration, to be Black is to be criminal, to be deviant, right? And she argues that each one of these kind of racialized caste systems is connected to the others, right? And that they're basically direct legacies of the others. That white supremacy might have been created through the system of slavery or through the system of kind of whiteness that was created in colonial America, at least our modern context of this, right? But white supremacy didn't die with slavery. It just changed in the way it manifests. So, right? So when you think about the modern mass incarceration, the roots of which are found in slavery and the time period right after, right? So in the Reconstruction era, not to give you like a whole history lesson, but the book does, if you want to read her book, she gets real in depth about it. But, you know, during the Reconstruction era, that was basically the first prison boom, right? Was what they call convict leasing. The situation where the South was obviously devastated economically when slavery ended because they were like forcing people to work for free. So now that they didn't have that, their economic kind of structure folded. So they created these like BS, weird, inane laws to try to target African Americans so they could force them to continue working in, you know, slavery by another name conditions and profit off that labor, right? So convict leasing was how this was done. Basically, you get charged for like a random ass crime, and then the only way you could serve your sentence was to work off that crime, right? In convict leasing. So, for example, you looked a white person in the face, or you walk through a town after dusk, like just random stuff, right? I think, what was the one that was like mischief? Like, what the hell does that mean, right? Things like that. And so they would be levied against people for the most arbitrary infractions, and they would round people up, take them to these farms, and they would have to work off the labor, right? So again, another slavery-like system. And what's really sad about it too, I mean, obviously slavery is a horrible exploitive system where people were maimed and treated terribly, but under convict leasing, it was actually more deadly because instead of seeing people as property that were to kind of like be kept alive for their own financial exploitation, there in convict leasing, a lot of people just died because the way that the people leasing the convicts or the companies that were profiting from this, the way they saw it was, hey, we're just going to get a bunch of people tomorrow. So what's the point? So they would make people work for 16 hours a day in the field, no water, no food, nothing. People would just die in the fields. And so this was, again, that first prison boom, basically, of American society is connected to the time period right after slavery, right? Why? Because there was such white supremacist fears of insurrection, of power, getting into the status of people that had no power, that there had to be a new racialized caste system to control people. And especially because Reconstruction did see some improvements, right? It saw the Freedmen's Bureau being created. It saw, advances in education, voting rights for African-American men, things like that were really, inspiring and something that like kind of opened up all these opportunities for a new world. And instead, a new racialized caste system was formed because of the fear and the need of a, control for white supremacy. So Jim Crow segregation comes out of that. So, because think about it, obviously under slavery, it made no sense to keep people separate because you were forcing people to labor for you, right? That doesn't make sense to have someone then be separate. But then when, there's a fear of someone taking your job or living in your neighborhood, dating your daughter, right? Things like that. Segregation became a way to kind of, again, make sure that people of color did not have the same opportunities, especially because there was a lot of gains in education during the Reconstruction era. So they had to make sure that if, kids of color were going to be educated, that they would get terrible substandard education, that their education would track them into menial jobs and, kind of service industry, or not service, but, just kind of menial work, low pay, low skill work jobs, right? So, and it's really, again, just a justification of inequality, because if you educate someone to fourth grade, you educate another person to college, which person knows more stuff? The person who went to college. So then you say, well, look, superiority, and not as if it's not just the reflection of unequal treatment, right? So Jim Crow segregation also has a lot of connection to mass incarceration, or the way that she argues that the racial caste system of today operates, meaning in Jim Crow segregation, there is a legal justification for inequality, right? That you're unequal in schools and housing, in facilities, and all accommodations, right? Voting, everything. Especially during Jim Crow era, it's really interesting when you look at the Civil Rights era. You have the Civil Rights Act is passed, but then you still needed the Voting Rights Act to be passed in 1964. And if you've ever seen the film Selma, which if you haven't, you should, it really does a great job of outlining why this was so important. Like in that film, Oprah's character goes to register to vote, which is supposedly legal, and she's asked to recite the preamble to the Constitution. So she's like, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice," blah, 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 does the whole thing. Then they ask her all these inane questions, who are your senators, who are your representatives, who are whatever. And then they're like, "How many judges are in the county?" And she's like, "I don't know, I can't remember exactly. It was like 72. Name them all." And it's like, who could do that? Right? And it's like, well, that's the standard by which you can then register to vote. So even though people were legally allowed to, there were so many ways that people were restricted from actually gaining access to vote. Why? Because voting is power, right? And there was really obvious, blatant attempts to try to keep people away from this. Even when legal systems, allowed for that right, there was still KKK trying to, post up outside of these polling places to intimidate people away. That's actually one of the things that the Black Panthers used to do, is they would post up in front of a polling place to like keep away the KKK and other folks like that, so people felt more safe voting. But anyway, there was all of these ways in which, poll taxes, literacy tests, things like that tried to systematically discriminate against, poor people of color to make sure that they couldn't gain access or rights. And so she argues that there's still a lot of that legal segregation and separation when it comes to mass incarceration today. Meaning, she calls it the cruel hand, like the 5 things that are taken from you if you get a felony status in our culture, which a lot of people, again, are swept into that system through plea bargains and not because of their actual guilt, right? So as we saw with the Emma Faye Stewart situation, you lose public housing. You can't get any public housing. You can't get financial aid for school. You can't get food stamps. Right? You have to mark that box on a job application that says felony, which is a huge one. And then, of course, you have the stigma of the community. People see you as, oh, you were touched by the criminal justice system, you must be a bad person, right? That's a huge thing to try and overcome. And then, of course, voting, right? Basically, in most states, people are legally restricted for 7-11 years, or sometimes forever, from being able to vote. Because they have that felony status. So she argues that basically is putting someone back into a Jim Crow segregation situation. When you look at the millions of people in prison, right? We have more people incarcerated in the United States than any place in the world, right? We're 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prison population. And when you look at that prison population, it's so unequally distributed among, race and ethnicity that it's not at all representative. Right? When the stats she was saying from the Human Rights Watch, if, about 13% of the population is African American, then why is it that 80 or 90% of the people going into prison in 1 year for drug crimes are African American? That just doesn't make sense, right? Statistically or otherwise. So, she's saying that this, again, justifies a legal status of saying separate, of you can't get the same housing, you can't get the same job opportunities, you can't get, the education or any of these things, which really kind of puts people back into that same system. So she really argues that you create this colorblind criminal justice system, but it still has very racially discriminatory results because you act as if, the consequences are really just a reflection of, unequal criminality and not a reflection of the power dynamics that exist in our culture. We know that you can pay your way out of the criminal justice system. Obviously, that's extremely problematic in a system with so much income inequality, right? So I think the best example of this in the modern era is what happened in Florida. So Florida was one of those states where if you get a felony status, you can't vote again ever. And they passed a law a couple of years ago to say those people could be reenfranchised. Now, Florida is one of those states that when elections happen, people always look to Florida. And there's been some close calls, not only the 2000 thing where people literally just like destroyed ballots so that Bush would win. That's a whole nother thing. But in general, Florida's often a very close call for those counts, right? For the stupid electoral college, which is like a whole nother slavery holdover that we shouldn't have. But that's a whole nother lecture. So anyway. So in Florida, what happened was they voted to reenfranchise these people, but then the conservative Republicans in the state tried to pass another addendum to that law because that law would reenfranchise over 3 million people, which is a lot. If you're talking about elections being predicated on, a couple hundred, a couple thousand votes, then millions of people, that's going to make a big difference. And there's an assumption because of the social class and, race and ethnicity assumptions, there's an assumption that a lot of these people are going to vote liberal or Democrat, right? So conservatives within Florida tried to pass this law saying that you could only apply to be reenfranchised, right, to get your vote back, if you've already paid off your court fees and all of, because a lot of people don't realize that when you go to jail or court or any of this stuff, there's like fines, fees, and restitution you have to pay. And so, if you're broke and you're already going into the system, that's going to be very difficult to do, right? So what they tried to do is say, okay, well, only the people that can pay their way out of it are able to vote now, right? So really just, again, using social class status and bias as a way to kind of maintain inequality in a system that's supposed to just be based on you do the crime, you do the time. So it's interesting how that's another aspect of how these things kind of achieve a racially discriminatory result, is the structure of the system itself is predicated on all of our social inequalities and all of our power dynamics in the culture.